It is one of the most bizarre cases of potential alien contact ever documented. It goes well beyond the expectations of a normal UFO sighting and has implications which are, to say the least, staggering, at least with regard to how potential alien beings might interact with or even harm human subjects. I'm Aaron Deese, once again joined by Ron Murphy, Heather Bozier, Katie Page, Micah Hanks, and Mark Matsky. This is UFOs Revisited, and today we are discussing the Vegetable Man of West Virginia. So this is going to be an interesting discussion, at least putting it somewhat lightly. This encounter took place on the outskirts of Fairmont, West Virginia in 1968. So once again, we're in the 60s, at least with regard to general UFO phenomena, because it seems that there's a lot of activity that centers in this period, 50s, 60s, 70s. The witness was an Air Force veteran named Jennings Frederick, who was alone and was bow hunting in the woods near his home.
He started to hear this really loud whirring sound, which he likened to like a record spinning way too quickly. And pretty soon he saw this large, thin entity, light green, which is where the vegetable idea comes in. It didn't actually look like a piece of broccoli or anything. Large vegetable green type entity walked toward him and almost telepathically tells him, "It's okay, don't fear me. I'm in need of medical assistance." You actually have the quote in here, "You need not fear me. I wish to communicate. I come as a friend. We know of you all. I come in peace. I wish medical assistance. I need your help." And then he grabs a hold of Jennings Frederick and has these suction cup-like fingers with needles on them. And then as he's holding on to him, his eyes turn red and like mesmerize Jennings Frederick so that I'm guessing so that he doesn't feel the pain as much. And then once he has his fill of the blood, he lets him go and starts to run up the hill and then just kind of disintegrates. And that's it for the Veggie Man. And it turns out that that's not the only time that Jennings Frederick had actually had an encounter with a creature, but it was his only encounter with what we have come to know as the Veggie Man.
So right off the bat, there's a lot to unpack here. So I guess let's go back to the beginning. This initial quote that comes from this creature, it starts off by saying, "You need not fear me." That to me is very interesting because it states that at some capacity, this creature or entity understands human points of reference. It understands concepts like fear, at least. One thing that I'm really interested to get everyone's take on is the fact that if you flip through the Bible, over and over and over again, this is a mantra that we hear. Anytime an angelic or spiritual being appears, it's "don't be afraid, you don't need to be afraid of me." And then we see that reiterated here in this very bizarre encounter. So I'm curious as to what everyone's take on that is.
Well, I would certainly say that the Veggie Man, if it understood our concept of fear, it had a very interesting concept of medical assistance.
That's my next question, actually.
Right.
Yes.
And that being the case, it almost seems like a bait and switch, wouldn't it? I mean, like, please help me so that I can grab you and extract blood from your body. But it's off-putting, to say the least. But yeah, it's an interesting point that he begins with, "Have no fear," for the reasons you mentioned, the biblical precedent for that, and make of it what you will. Jennings Frederick's obituary lists him as a Methodist. So a member of a confessing Christian background. If that had any play in this encounter, it's hard to say. But that was part of his biography.
So this was telepathically stated, correct? I think this is what we're talking about.
That's my understanding, is
Right,
that it
right.
was beamed into his mind,
Right.
so to speak.
Or is that what he thought to make the situation a little bit more palatable to him, you know what I mean? Especially if you're encountering something like this, I don't think the kid really had a choice, this guy didn't have a choice in the matter. I think that might have been a way for him to cope with what's going on. So if we could take that little trope out of the way, maybe this thing didn't actually talk to him, but he did encounter something out in the woods that made no sense out of he couldn't make any sense out of it, and it was also detrimental to him in some way, right? It was something was using him as a feeding source. So but one of the reasons why I am so fascinated with this case is, unlike the other ones we saw with the Nordics and the references of the Greys, is this makes sense to me because we're dealing with an entity that is so foreign to the way we look. This isn't your typical anthropomorphic alien, right? This is something that obviously developed, this is a true story, this is something that developed in an evolutionary basis so unlike what we deal with, right? And I think that that's what's so interesting about this, because this person did not encounter something that looked remotely like us. This was something completely out of the ordinary.
And it's described also as the creature was fleeing or retreating, that it was jumping in bounds of 20 to 25 feet, depending on the report that you're looking at or the interpretation. So, this whole idea that it could possibly hypnotize or mesmerize, prey, let's go with that line of speculation for a while. And then it also has this ability to flee very rapidly, trying to fit it into what we know about animal biology and how predators behave. Some of it makes sense, some of it doesn't make any sense at all. It's very confounding to me in that way.
It's interesting too, the timeline, like the 60s and the 70s, we have other cases and we have more landed craft, more entities that are spotted. The Carl Higdon case out of Wyoming, where another hunter, so he's out hunting, and Carl Higdon was out hunting elk and encounters a creature and the same kind of telepathic message, and stops his bullet, and they have evidence of the bullet. It's a fascinating case out of there, but I think that this case in particular kind of fits in line as, yes, it's an outlier case, but for the reasons Ron mentioned, I think it's one that we shouldn't overlook and look into. Yeah.
Right. And again, you have somebody stepping out of their world and entering into another world, even though that they utilize that for hunting and they obviously knew enough about the natural environment, they encounter something from that or something in that world that they assume is alien, but may be quite natural in that world as well too, which is one of the reasons why I think that we have to use the word cryptid in this, because from a cryptozoological perspective, we are dealing with an obvious biological entity, if this is to be believed, and it's unknown, so it would fall into the category of a cryptozoological creature.
What's kind of interesting too is that there's that other dimension of the, classic kinds of demonic behaviors, right? Now, I'm not actually trying to make an argument that whatever Mr. Frederick said that he experienced was demonic, but I'm saying that if you look at traditional views about vampirism, about creatures of the night, sucking blood and stealing the very essence, the life's essence from humans, we see those kinds of characteristics in a case like this. An otherworldly being that comes and takes of a person's very vital essence in order to feed itself, presumably. So, there is that sort of kind of dark and I would dare say evil, or at least in terms of what humans associate with evil, archetypically and classically speaking, you have some of those elements too. Still, you also have the implication, though, through medical assistance. I joked about that earlier, but if indeed that was what telepathically was delivered in this case, and if we're talking about a true set of circumstances, that it saw this as being, you're going to help me by giving me a transfusion. I'm in desperate need of sustenance. Maybe it wasn't so much, I'm going to drink your blood in an attempt to hurt you. It's I need some help. Hold still.
But does that now add credence to or take away, distract from the case that it's an extraterrestrial entity? Because how would it be able to utilize what we are made of for purposes of healing itself?
That was my next question. How is it even possible, if we're looking at something that evolved in a different environment, that it can in any way interact with our blood for whatever it wanted, iron, hemoglobin, whatever? Why is there any reason to assume that we would be in any way biologically compatible? You can't give a blood transfusion to any person. Mm-hmm. So another species, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one.
And the way that story ends, it's an important detail in what Heather said is just how it happened, but the idea being Veggie Man didn't just bound away out of sight. As he was bounding away, he dematerialized, is the words that are in the report, which, by most standards is not a simple biological fact that we can just vanish from sight. So there would seem to be other things going on there as well.
High strangeness indeed.
Yeah, very much. It almost takes us into And I said I was going to try to get through this show without talking about werewolves, but it almost takes us into certain aspects of the dogman phenomena where you have something that interacts with the world around it in a corporeal, biological sense, but then has these other aspects that are so striking and so bizarre, they don't fit. So it seems to preclude the notion of a natural animal. But again, clearly a biological something at some capacity.
And I think it's necessary that you do invoke other cryptids into this as well too, because why did this gentleman feel that it was extraterrestrial or not of this earth, right? I mean, there was some circumstantial evidence there that he perceived it to be, but if it wasn't, then we can look at other animals. Does Bigfoot drink human blood? No. Whenever, like you had said, the things that consume on a human being usually is perceived as evil, right? And if I'm not mistaken, this gentleman's mother also had a case which she viewed as extraterrestrial as well too, but her comment was that the entity was evil, and she called it demonic. So we already have this idea out there implanted in this person's head that his mother saw something that she couldn't explain, so it was demonic. And then by reference is what he is now engaging with in the environment. He's just seeing as extraterrestrial because that's something that was already in his mind from what his mother told him about her incident, because it could be something completely natural. So I want to share this for the first time here on this panel. I was doing a podcast, and the host shared with me his encounter with a veggie man, a stick man. That's what he called it. Oh. So he's out in the woods, and in a small little glen, an opening in the woods, he sees a stick rise up about 3 feet. He didn't think much about it. He said the wind wasn't blowing or anything like that. And then it went down, and then it came back up again. And he said there was something odd going here. And as he continued to watch it, he said that it sprouted like hands and legs, and it took off. So he started to chase it, like I think anybody would, because it's a gosh darn stick, right? So he's chasing it, and it comes to a bank of a river, and it jumps, and as it jumps, the feet and the legs and the arms vanish, and it becomes just a regular stick, lands in the water and floats away, as if it was able to work within the environment in order to flee the situation. That's the only other time I've ever heard of a situation like this, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, I was very incredulous whenever I heard this as well too. But he seemed to be telling me a story that he had a difficult time wrapping his mind around. But again, he did not think that it was extraterrestrial. He thought it was just something natural and uncatalogued. Yeah.
So that again takes us the cryptid question.
It's the cryptid question. Yeah, the cryptid question. Because but most cryptids though act within our idea of physics. It's only whenever these things are acting outside our knowledge that we start assigning them extraterrestrial qualities.
So that takes us into questions like organic camouflage.
Right. Well,
giant stick insects. Stick insects are a thing.
Exactly. Bigfoot has been known to materialize and dematerialize as well too. So I think that when we start going deep into the cryptid question, a lot of things that we view as monsters, things that go bump in the night, physical, tangible flesh and blood things, the deeper we get into that conundrum, the more the line is blurred between the extraterrestrial and the terrestrial.
Can we go back to his mother's experience?
Yes.
Because I think there's details there that help set the precedent for what his perception may have been. Iva was his mom's name, from Akron, Ohio, incidentally, if I'm not mistaken. She saw out in the backyard a small creature shoveling dirt and soil into a bag, and this little creature was tethered by some sort of line to a flying saucer, by any definition, that was hovering nearby. And as she kept observing this, the saucer took off and the creature was still sort of attached to it. So I think that helps, just those details. And as Ron said, that she referred to it as devilish or satanic looking, I think might be the actual quote. That was in his mind. That happened when he was still in high school. Then he goes off to the Air Force, and it's in this time that I think after he comes back that he has the Veggie Man experience. So that if she in fact shared that experience with him, that could have had an effect on how he was perceiving what was happening in his own context.
I've seen in a few places too, I mean, maybe a little confusion about that case and then the later case that Frederick describes of having, seen this, what he calls the veggie man. They seem to be pretty different descriptions.
Yeah.
The reason, for instance, that his mother had described what she allegedly saw as being demonic was because there was a tail and I think maybe even also horn-like protrusions or something. Now this clearly again was a being seen in association with the craft. The same was not necessarily the case with the later sighting of Veggie Man, although it was implied that there was a noise maybe that he interpreted as having been a craft taking off or something along those lines. Frankly, to me it leaves a lot of room for speculation there. But again, just to clear those two up, because I've seen some outlets say the earliest sighting of Veggie Man was actually by the mother, and in fact I think those are two different things, and the descriptions are completely...
Yeah, I think it's the saucer that's sets the paradigm for him.
Yeah,
instead
exactly.
of the creature, to your point.
Yeah. And the idea that the little creature was, like you said, taking things like samples.
Yeah.
Taking samples, so there was a question of what they're actually wanting to investigate from our planet, where the idea of Veggie Man taking blood, I don't think that isn't without precedent in the UFO world. I mean, as far as there's been stories of entities lacking in nutrients and therefore coming up with these hybridization, and I'm going to mess up the name, but is it Dulce or Dulce?
I say Dulce.
During the Dulce experiments, there was the whole idea of, which we'll get into at another time, but the whole idea that the alien race was lacking in nutrients and therefore used some of our DNA to kind of make up that detriment that they had. But also there are other stories. There's something called the Imjarvi elf that it was looked in similar appearance. If you look at the description or the actual drawing that Jennings Frederick made of Veggie Man, again, not looking like a piece of broccoli, but he's got this like hooked nose.
Yeah.
The Imjarvi elf had the exact same thing. It's not that we don't have other sightings of something similar to that. It's just that Jennings Frederick didn't necessarily have that same sighting. But his whole existence, he ends up writing letters to Gray Barker. They get in back, and that's how we find out as much as we do about Jennings Frederick, are from these letters that are still in the archives. He was visited by the Men in Black at one point in time. It's just keeping in line with all of the UFO type or UAP type things, he had all these boxes checked off. MIBs showed up at his house, and they even jabbed him with a needle, if I'm remembering correctly. So he was getting it from aliens and the Men in Black as well.
And it begs the question, here we go again, we have that same mother-son, that genetic line. Why them? Why Veggie Man? Well, is there a blood genetic connection there? I don't know.
We have to question motivations again too. This is a pretty tough pill to swallow, even for people in the unsolved paranormal cryptozoological community. Even being as open-minded as I am to a lot of these reported phenomena, I have a difficult time with this case. So why make this up? It would have been much easier, again, speaking hypothetically, it would have been much easier to say I saw Bigfoot, I saw some alien grays, I saw a flying saucer, versus this thing. And interesting too, that his mother saw some kind of creature collecting soil samples. That's also not a singular event. In On the Trail of UFOs, another Small Town Monsters production, we have a more recent sighting where pretty much that same thing is happening. Someone is seeing these creatures collect soil samples. So it's not a one-off. I find that very interesting.
There are a lot of cases, a lot of them. From over the years that involve soil samples being taken. And my hypothesis about that is that really there is probably somewhere, maybe on planet Serpo, a intergalactic museum of soil samples from parts of Earth.
Yeah.
They're fascinated with soil from our planet for some reason. It is true that there are a lot of soil samples that are taken.
Yeah, totally out of scope.
I'll throw something else in here too. One of the things that fascinates me about Veggie Man, and I don't know if y'all could tell, but I'm a little on the fence like yourself about whether there's a real Veggie Man out there, just a little. But the case is really interesting because Gray Barker was involved with all of this. And again, I'm as interested in the people who have reported these kind of mainstays of this phenomenon as I am in the phenomenon itself. Now, I try to study the phenomenon. I try to really observe what's going on with that, but you can't understand it without understanding the people behind it, and that comes back to what you said about motives. Gray Barker, we really have in a lot of ways to thank for the famous Men in Black, you know. And even though Albert Bender had been the first guy who had said that, you know, 3 men came and silenced him, and so the, you know, his efforts to document the saucer mystery ended up coming to an abrupt halt, and he cryptically said that he had found out the mystery, but, you know, he couldn't talk about it anymore. It was really Gray Barker. They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers was the name of the book, and really through the authorship of that book, he brings the narrative to a wider audience. And in a lot of ways, Keel kind of picked up that narrative too, and then they helped to kind of create the idea of the Men in Black. Although I do think that there are some pretty interesting cases where people literally wearing black suits have shown up and have actually silenced UFO, you know, observers and others who have had relationship to UFO sightings and cases. I mean, that's another conversation for another day. But Gray Barker's role in kind of myth making is interesting, because I do think that, and those who knew him would say this, Keel had even said this, Gray liked to tell a good story. And there was one famous case a few years ago where someone who had contributed to some of his early journals and his newsletters had said, you know, I wanted to just, you know, share like a story I'd written, and I think that in fact it had been fiction, but Gray had encouraged him to say, well, create a name of like an organization that we can use to make this sound a little spicier, make it more interesting. And then names from the alleged organization were later borrowed in other narratives that Gray told in his other newsletters. And so, you know, when I see Veggie Man on the cover of Gray Barker's newsletter, episode number 5 from 1976, I'm thinking, you know, this has all the hallmarks of a classic Gray Barker. Let's see if we can embellish this a little bit and see where it goes. I mean, that could be happening, or maybe not. But
well, points of origin are incredibly important. As with any of the cases we're going to discuss or have discussed, where did this come from? You know, who produced it and why? So it's very easy at the surface level to say, okay, you know, Jennings was a Air Force veteran who was bow hunting. Why would he make this up? But if we look at the other players, there may be some more going on in the background here. And that's not for me to say the story is or is not true, but that's extremely important in these conversations, especially cases like this that do seem so inexplicable. It's not even a UFO encounter. It's something on a completely different level as we're learning together. But yeah, it's very important information.
So going back to the mother sighting, what do you, or what do people assume the collection of soil was for? It was a sample of some kind, correct? Probably to see what it was made of or what it affected, I guess, right? So the idea of taking a sample from the environment is pretty similar to what Veggie Man did to this gentleman as well, too, right? And just took a sample to see what was going on. And again, you know, when we talk about other cases of like cattle mutilations or abductions, it does indeed seem that there is an agenda involved in testing human to see about how they're reacting to the environment around them. Yeah, and this takes place in the great state of West Virginia, correct? Well, I mean, look at that. There's mining down there, and there's a lot of different things going on there. So it might have been a process of finding out exactly how the environment is affecting these people in a particular situation.
Although if you extend that to the entire phenomenon, really looking broadly at the UFO subculture, you make a really good point, Ron, because I mean, you mentioned cattle mutilations. If we look at some of John Lear's dark hypothesis ideas, you know, where he would go on to say during the 80s and 90s that, you know, really what the extraterrestrial agenda is they're not just abducting us, but they're literally taking some of us and they're bathing in our blood and doing all these horrific things. Again, there's a pretty pervasive narrative that we see in all that much like we could compare experiencer claims to fairy folklore from the British Isles, there's this kind of dark, demonic, vampiric thing that's also been injected, to use a term, into a lot of the UFO subculture, which again, I mean, to me those horrific elements, they really kind of strain credulity, but it's interesting that you see that and it's so prevalent. It's also kind of hard in the case of cattle mutilations to dispute that somebody's taking cows, removing the soft tissues, organs, exsanguination does occur. The good old skeptical argument that these are just simple predation cases, you know, insects and small creatures are just eating the eyes, and you know, I've spoken with people who've investigated some of those cases firsthand. There are some prosaic cases of cattle deaths, and I've looked into a few of those myself. There are others that clearly indicate that there's some kind of an actual removal of what specimen samples, who knows? But it's interesting that again is kind of this underlying theme that you
Right.
see, and that this is reflected in both of the cases that the Fredericks talk about, whether it's the extraction of soil sampling or if it's maybe collecting a sample in a different way and of a different kind.
And when we're talking about blood specifically, that's something that is deeply significant across cultures, across human society for as long as we've had society. Blood is something that's deeply, deeply symbolic. So it's...
And the same way with the vampire myth, it's very intimate in order to extract it as well too. You're still alive, and something has to lay a hand on you, or and extract it from a still living being. So I think that that's another part of the tell as well. And like vampires, UFOs descend out of the darkness. Sometimes they come into your bedroom whenever you're at your weakest. It has a lot of different cross-cultural significances, but at the end of the day, it still fits well into the idea of the archetype of something coming in and feeding upon you that's vampiric.
I'd like to go back to Gray Barker,
Yes.
if we could, because it's thanks to Gray Barker that we really know anything about Jennings, and there's a lot more to be said about him that we haven't even scratched the surface on.
Please.
In Gray Barker's collected papers, which are at the Clarksburg-Harrison Public Library, there's a whole file on Frederick. And when you look through those, what becomes clear is that he was a much bigger player than you might expect. To just, you think this might be a one-off little thing in Gray Barker's newsletter, but it turns out he was corresponding with Jerome Clark. He was writing to John Keel. He either wanted to or had an audience with Linda Scarberry and wanted to interview her, I think. And all of that to just set to the side, there is another experience that he had in 1967 where he reported that he was picked up by a craft, guided around the interior of it by a figure named Zarkon. And he's 10 feet tall, bald, 3 fingers, from Triangulus Delphi.
Oh.
Yes. And then had another experience with smaller figures that were more benevolent, claimed to work for NASA, was discharged from NASA. And so he had all of these things going on in his life. He made a cassette tape of his experiences that evidently he was maybe selling via mail order. I'm not sure about that. But all that is to say, and this really is a deep cut going back to something Katie said before, that 60s and 70s time period, you had figures like this emerging into the public eye, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, and the person it put me in mind of as this whole story unfolded was Woody Derenberger, who had a very similar track, leading up to the whole Indrid Cold Grinning Man experience by the highway. West Virginia context, sort of a simple, everyday person having what on the face of it are ridiculous sounding experiences, but not backing off from them and just putting it out there, having, like Derenberger and the whole Lanulos story, claiming to have a interaction with a alien being that lasted for a long time. And so that's when you said that it was like people in the 60s and 70s, he fits that profile in an almost eerie sort of way. That there would be a Jennings Frederick and a Woodrow Derenberger, both from West Virginia, both having had military backgrounds to a certain degree. It just is mind-boggling. And then all these connections with Gray Barker and John Keel, these important figures, all moving in the same circles. It's just fascinating to me.
It's interesting. Like, what are the chances of
Yeah.
Well, don't you think that when we talk about aliens, we try to make them into archetypes, right? We talk about that because it's simple to like. It's easier to digest, right? If we make them into archetypes, we can figure it out. But don't these people that are experiencing these things also fit the role of the everyman? They're us, right? They're us who are experiencing things that they cannot describe, and through them, we kind of indulge in these conversations and figure out, well, what did they see? Because that might make sense to what we're going through as well, too.
It's a compelling case. It captures the imagination in a way that some cases I don't think can, because it is such an intersection of, we're talking about vampiric lore, we're talking about potential UFO sightings, the continuation of a family legacy, but then also perhaps there was a financial incentive on the other side of the coin here. And this is one that, personally, I just have a really hard time settling on. It's hard to stop on this one. While the case of the Veggie Man seems to be a singular or anomalous event, as we've learned today, it may have potential connections to other UFO and or cryptid cases. Regardless of whether or not the case of the Veggie Man actually took place, it provides us with nearly endless lines of speculation on the nature of extraterrestrial entities and how human beings might interact with them.
This has been an incredibly enjoyable and educational experience.
What a great experience this has been.
This has really been an incredible opportunity to talk with people who not only have very unique insights on the cases that we looked into, and really more broadly, the whole UFO phenomenon and the subculture, but it also was a really cool experience, I think, in the context of being able to, in real time, hash out some of the finer details about these cases. I mean, I personally learned some things from these conversations, and at one point sitting there at the table with everybody, it felt a whole lot less like a UFO discussion and almost like a think tank. How can we come back together and look at these cases and look at them maybe in a different way, pour over the details, apply, in hindsight, our modern perspectives on the UAP issue, but look back at them and indeed get a fresh perspective. I certainly got that.
I have to tell you, before this experiment began, I was a little apprehensive because I'm really not a UFO guy. I'm more into the history of the paranormal and cryptozoology. But I would tell you, whenever we really got in depth into these UFO conundrums, you really see that it is part not only of the paranormal world, but a part of our world in general.
For me, this has kind of taken me out of my lane a little bit on focusing on the high strangeness ranches and some other high focus cases I'm working on, covering a wide range of topics. And I've learned a lot. And really at the end of the day, I think so much of what we uncovered here in these discussions has led to really how this affects humanity, the individual experiencers, the researchers, the government cover-ups, what it's going to look like for disclosure. So many topics were covered, and it's really opened my eyes to so many really important parts of UFOs, Bigfoot, and cryptids. And I think a lot of these topics are intertwined as what was discovered here on UFOs Revisited. So I'm really thankful and grateful as part of this wonderful panel.
So this was an incredible experience. I learned a lot of stuff. I definitely felt like a fish out of water with people way beyond my skill set in this field. But yeah, it's been great to see the connection between ufology and cryptozoology, sometimes realms into the paranormal as well. So it's been quite an experience.
As long as I've been interested in this topic and as much research as I've done into it, every single discussion we had, I came away knowing something that I didn't know the day before. And I hope that anyone watching this will have a similar experience. I hope they enjoy it, and I hope they learn at least something. What sticks out to me, the big thing that comes up in my mind again and again is, regardless of whether some of these stories are true, regardless what the nature of them is, if they are extraterrestrial, if they are not, at the end of the day, they have real, tangible impacts on the people that witness them. That is something that is very real. We can wonder what is or is not an alien and what their intentions might be, but the impact that this phenomena has on people is happening right in front of us. And I think that may be the most important thing of all the topics that we've covered.
Yeah, this was a great experience. I really enjoyed talking about UFOs, but maybe the thing I enjoyed the most was listening to the other panelists talk about the topic. I think my biggest takeaway from it so far is actually the tie between ufology and pop culture and how one influences the other. that was something that kept popping up in almost every topic we talked about. So I was very interested in that, and it plays into what I do as a documentarian. So very interesting stuff, and I can't wait to learn more.